Hi, and welcome to another episode of Restoring the Soul. I'm Michael John Cusick, and I'm here today again with my friend Peter Zaremba. Hi, Peter.
Hey.
Hey, we are in New York City. And if you listen to my podcast with Rob Mathis, I was in town this weekend to hear the Rob Mathis Band do his 30th anniversary of the Christmas concert. Make sure to check out that podcast. And the reason why I decided to record this on the 25th floor of the Marriott Courtyard at 5th Avenue and 40th, right across from the New York Public Library, is that today this may be one of the busiest spots in America. And I think there's evidence that says that it's a good idea to think about a practice, and whether it's actually effective or not is whether it works in the most extreme conditions. And so here we are at 40th and 5th Avenue in New York City. And if you're listening carefully, you can hear a jackhammer in the background. The building that we're in is actually under construction, and there are signs all over saying, please pardon our dust. But what better place to talk about welcoming the unpleasant emotions, welcoming the struggles, welcoming all of the things that are happening inside of us, than New York City, where all around us there's chaos in the midst of Christmas decorations saying this is the happiest time of year. There's poverty, there's homeless people, the city smells bad, there's trash all over the streets, but I love it. If you've never been to New York City, may you one day come here and try to find some enjoyment. So there's horns that I'm hearing in the background, and we'll probably hear a siren at some point. But Peter, let's jump into the welcoming prayer. This has been a practice for you more than me, but it's something that I have done. Will you talk about what the welcoming prayer is and how it has been helpful in your own life?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to attend the Living School, and Cynthia Brijol was one of our instructors. And so she's written the defining book on centering prayer called Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening. She dedicates an entire chapter to the welcoming prayer, and I would highly recommend that book. There's a diagram that is kind of the centerpiece for her explanation of the welcoming prayer from Thomas Keating, Father Thomas Keating, that shows a middle delineating line. Everything below it is unconscious, everything above it is conscious. And so he talks about the false self system for happiness, power and control, esteem, affection, approval, and safety and security.
And let me just interject. When you talk about the false self, he also calls that the programs for happiness.
Yes.
So if people get hung up on the word false self, what is that? True self, ego, shadow. The false self is basically the way that our unconscious creates these programs for happiness.
Exactly. So we've talked about this in a very recent podcast. My false program for happiness is I get out of bed and say, I'm going to have everyone in my life love me and affirm and approve of me, right? I'm laughing as I say it, right? So, and then we go about, we go out our day and we rise above the unconscious into the conscious world, and we start interacting with people. And if my goal is to get their approval and to get their love, so to speak, if I disappoint them, if I somehow feel shame, feel that I've failed, or that I have not achieved that goal, I can get very frustrated, right? And at that point, there's an opportunity when the frustration first arises, feelings of shame, feelings of rejection, there's a point where the welcoming prayer can be a tool, a transformational tool to deal with that. First, let me say, if I move from that frustration, essentially I get immersed in the shame. I don't have a feeling, the feeling has me. And then it takes me down below the waterline again into my unconscious, where really all I do is double down. Right? The answer is to double down now on my false program for happiness. And I'm going to try harder tomorrow, change my strategies and change my techniques. But in that moment, if we can back up to the moment where that afflicting emotion comes up and there's frustration, welcoming prayer is a practice that is best practice at the speed of life. What I mean that is, if I can take a couple minutes alone when I'm feeling that rejection and that shame, practice the welcoming prayer. It has 3 steps. The first is to focus, right? To focus and feel. So that shame is embodied somewhere in my body. And for me, it's high in my rib cage. And the beginning of the welcoming prayer is to just get in touch with the sensation. What does it feel like to feel that shame? How does it show up in my body? And not to try and deal with it or to psychologize it, not to go in my head with it, just to stay body-based.
To observe it, to notice it.
Exactly. And to let it, to feel it, in a sense, to really own what it feels. And for me, I'll even put my hand in that high rib cage place. And so that is the first step. The second step is to slowly name and welcome that afflicting emotion. So I begin to say things like, welcome shame, welcome rejection, welcome failure. And if there's something maybe even beneath that, welcome disappointment. And then, so the welcoming prayer, it is a rocking back and forth between the two steps. I'm welcoming and I'm feeling. I'm focusing, I'm observing, and then I'm welcoming. And as that rocking between the first two steps takes place, there's a loosening of the knot. The knot of that emotion begins to loosen. And at some point, we're at a place where I can do this. I can hold this, right? I can experience it, and I can have this emotion, and it doesn't have to have me. And at some point, and we don't want to be in a rush here on this, but at some point, we can simply hand it over and we let it go to God.
Therefore, this idea of surrender, which evangelical Christians will talk a lot about, we need to surrender, we need to trust God, we need to, in the 12-step programs, they'll often use the phrase, let go, let God. What does that mean? That can be an exasperating kind of cliche, but this idea of surrender actually happens by this process of being with it. As you say, and I love this analogy, the knot unties, and that allows us to surrender into it, to entrust it to our loving God. And this doesn't always happen, but as that knot becomes untied and we surrender it, that feeling will dissipate or subside substantially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the surrender is not passive. It's not I give up. This is nothing I can do here. I can't participate in this process of healing, but it's an active handing over, letting go, forgiving. To me, the words surrender, forgive, letting go are synonymous. One important note, what we're welcoming is the afflictive emotion. We're not welcoming the circumstance. So example, years ago, I had a cancerous polyp detected, and it was removed, and they wanted to do a resection to find out if it had metastasized into my colon, if there was colon cancer, right? So I wasn't practicing the welcoming prayer back then, but had I, for my fear, because I was deathly afraid until I got the results back. If I were practicing the welcoming prayer, it would not be welcome cancer, right? It would not be, welcome death. It would be welcome fear, welcome unknown, welcome uncertainty. So that's important, right? We're not welcoming the circumstance. We're welcoming the afflictive emotion. And boy, I don't want to get her name wrong, but someone who really early on was instrumental in developing the welcoming prayer was a Brooklyn-born psychiatric nurse named Mary Morwanski, I believe is her last name.
I read about her in Cynthia's book.
Yeah. And so she went a little further. Whenever she would do her letting go, after she had, done the first two steps of focusing and welcoming, when she would surrender the afflictive emotion, she would say, I surrender my needs for power and control. I surrender my needs for safety and security. I surrender my needs for esteem, affection, approval. And I surrender my need for anything to change or get better.
I love that. Say that again.
Yeah. I surrender my needs for power and control. I surrender my needs for safety and security. I surrender my needs for esteem, affection, and approval. And I surrender my need for anything to change or get better. It's this, not a death blow to the ego, because the ego is not bad. It's just, it is a full surrender of that false program of happiness. And the most important thing, like anything else, the welcoming prayer is an ongoing practice. You don't surrender and welcome your fear and then never have to surrender fear again, right?
Right. And I just want to interject that surrender, once again, is not I'm surrendering to cancer. And surrendering is not saying that I don't care if this gets healed. We can still pray, God heal the cancer. I'm still going to ask people to drive me to the hospital. I don't have to give in to despair, but it's not yet an acceptance of the circumstance. And there are, as we'll talk about in another podcast, there are circumstances that we cannot change and that we actually have to accept them. Once again, it's an acceptance of the emotion, of the experience within us. It's the perceptions in our body. It could be a migraine headache that somebody has, or a physical pain, chronic pain, because Cynthia has written about this in terms of chronic pain, that if someone has a ruptured disc in their back, and that's a chronic issue, which a friend of mine has right now, and they're in and out of pain. I had dinner with him the other night. I said, how'd you fly here, to town when we had dinner? And he said, well, I can stand up. I can sit down, but every time I stand up is when it hurts. So when he stands up, there's this need to be aware of what's happening. And if his body and his mind are going, this pain is awful. This I can't stand this pain. I can't wait till I get my next dose of medication. It's not wrong to be relieved of the pain, but the resistance and the trying to shut down, or if you could watch me on video right now, listeners, my hands are open versus clenching. And as soon as I clench, things become tight and my autonomic nervous system goes into a sympathetic mode where I'm activated and I begin to move into a fight or flight mode. So this prayer, this welcoming prayer, is we're not fleeing from it. We're not fighting it. We're being with it. And I know I just restated everything you said, but I think for me, hearing about the welcoming prayer over and over in different ways has helped me beyond the practice of the welcoming prayer, but this idea of non-resistance, non-judgmental acceptance. And so this is not resisting, but accepting.
You hit the nail on the head. One of the lines, I don't believe it's in her chapter on the welcoming prayer, but at the Living School, she introduced the welcoming prayer with on the premise that whatever we resist persists.
Carl Jung said that.
Yeah, whatever we resist persists. And so a dear friend of mine who was a brilliant engineer suffered a stroke, and his right arm, his right leg, and his speech was impacted. Not his brilliant mind. And so he still has full mental capacity. But what was difficult for him, we had lunch recently, is, and it has to be just so maddening, such a suffering for him, is he knows what he wants to say and he can't get it out. And so what he says is, the harder I try and grab it, the more elusive it becomes. That's my words, not his, but where he goes, and he even said, like in the middle of our lunch one time, he just goes, calm down. At first I thought he was talking to me. He's self-talk, calm down, so that he could access what was there. Yeah,
that's beautiful. That's a good picture of non-resistance. And for me, as I even hear those words, calm down, I would need to hear those words and then breathe and exhale, because for me, just the mental is not enough. I need to kind of align that with my embodied state. And so much of my calmness is a physical state.
Right.
So let's review the 3 steps to the welcoming prayer.
The first is to focus and observe and to deeply feel, right? So by focus, we mean our emotions are body-based. And I had to learn, I think women intuit that fairly naturally. I won't speak for other men, I'll speak for myself. I never realized how body-based my emotions were. The first step in the welcoming prayer, let's say it's fear, which I usually feel in my throat area, like a tightening of my throat. My mouth gets dry. If I were consumed with fear, and I was recently, that for me, I want to focus on that feeling, not think about it. Don't psychologize it. Don't try and, figure out its roots. Just allow yourself to be present to the emotion. And if it helps to put your hand where you carry that emotion in your body, do it. If it helps to give it a color, a name, a sound, whatever we can do to observe and to feel the depth, how afraid I was when I felt that fear. We want to get there. And then we want to begin slowly to name it into welcome. So step one is getting in touch with it, focusing on it. Step two is the welcoming. Welcome fear. Welcome uncertainty. Welcome threat. We're welcoming what's this emotion that's under. Welcome unsafe.
It could be sadness. Welcome, it could be shame. It could be
right?
Anger, irritability, frustration.
And so steps 1 and 2 are the majority of the work of welcoming prayer. And so there's this rocking back and forth. There's this, there's a give and take, but you keep feeling. So as we surrender, we go back to the feeling. We go back to feeling it. We go back to, and we're saying the words out loud. Welcome. We are speaking aloud the welcome. As we do that, this afflictive emotion, the knot that's in us, begins to loosen, begins to slowly become undone, and we feel it.
Let me say a word about speaking this out loud, because people might say, well, do I have to speak it out loud? And I remember years ago when I did a lot of inner healing prayer, and from time to time I'll still do that with clients. There was this kind of debate in some of the writings and teachings about whether you need to speak things out loud, the prayer. And even in Romans 10, it talks about if we confess with our mouth, the idea of saying something out loud. And neuro-linguistic programming is something that came about in the early 70s, and that has led to a lot of other therapies, but it's basically articulating out loud unpleasant, afflictive emotions, states, etc., and then pairing it with affirming kinds of statements, and sometimes even tapping at different points. So there's something called emotional freedom technique, which is a derivative of the early NLP or neuro-linguistic programming. And the idea behind this, as I do this with people, is when you speak something out loud, it's as if you're announcing it to your brain, as if our self is having a conversation with this organ called the brain. And when you do that, it's as if the brain, not a separate person, it's an organ within our body, but it's as if the brain goes, oh, you've got this. Instead of this being frightening and you're threatened by this emotion of anger, shame, fear, sadness, etc., or a physical pain like the headache or a body pain, instead of the brain reacting, I have to go into the mode to now protect or defend, the brain goes, oh. So I do think it's important to speak it out loud. When you and I were in the cathedral, there were, 1,000 people in there, and there were noises all over, and we did our thing that we always do here in New York City, where we sat for 20 minutes in silence and did centering prayer. And I kind of, it's probably, quote, sinful. I don't sit around judging my sins, but I kind of go in there trying to think like I'm going to flex my muscles and see how still and quiet I can be in the middle of these 1,000 people with tourists hustling and bustling in there. Because St. Patrick's Cathedral, even in the middle of a mass, is more of a tourist mecca with people snapping their phones and things like that. But I thought to myself, well, I can't really speak it out loud right now because I'm in a public place. But I was able to just kind of whisper because I wanted to be able to settle. I wanted to be able to find that quiet place within. But there was crazy noise and echo all around me. And so I just whispered. And I whispered the word Jesus to be able to kind of sink down into myself. That was a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I just think it's important to say that the speaking it out is helpful. Not necessary, but very, very helpful.
Couldn't agree more. It becomes real when it comes out of my mouth. I know that. And so, again, step 1, this focus. Step 2, the welcoming. We rock back and forth. Eventually, the knot loosens. And then the final stage is simply to hand that over, to forgive it, to surrender it to God. And the prayer of, I release my desires, my needs for power and control, for safety and security, for esteem, affection, approval, and for anything to get better or to change.
How long does this practice take?
Oh, great question. Where my centering prayer practice, I aim for 20 minutes. I don't always, sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 5. But the welcoming prayer, because it moves at the speed of life, is going to be there's no set period.
It could take 30 seconds. It could take 3 minutes.
It could take 30 seconds. It could take 5 minutes. It could take 10 minutes. How traumatizing is the afflictive emotion? And do you have the luxury of the space? If I'm hosting Thanksgiving and I'm feeling anger, I don't have the luxury, but if I could sneak in the bathroom and take a couple minutes and release that, it's going to be a better day.
So wait, while there's smoke coming out of the oven and the turkey is crispy and the windows are being thrown open and the smoke alarm's going off, you don't just disappear into your home office and where's Peter? No, this can be a brief thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's intensely practical. And I will say this, here's the motivator for folks listening. It is a true transformational practice. Self-awareness, seeing myself overattach, feeling, being able to identify how our emotion embodies us, and then surrendering. This is a practice that will change our life.
So a couple thoughts you just said, and then I actually want to do the welcoming prayer. So there's going to be a long period of silence. Most of us over-identify with our emotions, and we over-identify with our perceptions, experience, and sensations in our body. So that if we have an unpleasant state, as you said, we don't have the emotion has us. So this is a way to begin to realize that I am not my emotion. I am not being drawn in, or I don't have to be drawn in and consumed by this emotion right now.
And let me throw in too, this is a practice that will absolutely build your awareness and confidence of God's constant, infinite presence. That somehow, I've never done the welcoming prayer and not at the end felt more spacious, more compassionate, more filled with love, more connected to God. It's not always the same intensity or depth, but it will build an unshakable confidence in God's presence and regardless of our circumstances, and his love and his desire to heal and make us whole. It's beautiful.
And that's a beautiful part of this, because so often our overwhelming emotions and experiences create distance relationally, particularly shame, that Kurt Thompson and others have said that shame creates distance. But if I'm experiencing some kind of unpleasant emotion, like even just low-level irritability, I'm either going to be pushing people away or I'm going to be trying to control them to assuage my irritability. So this does create connection. And I'm glad you brought up the thing about feeling more connected to God, because there may be listeners who are new to this or maybe uncomfortable to a prayer that focuses on our body. Although we talk a lot about embodied spirituality. So they might say, well, wait a minute. I thought you said this was a welcoming prayer. You're not really talking to God. But the assumption is that Christ is in us. God is with us. He will never leave us or forsake us. And as I'm fond of always saying, Psalm 139, verse 7, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? So we don't need to go to a church to be with God. I don't need to open my Bible to be with God. I don't need to look up to the sky to pray to God. When I'm with myself and I'm gently aware of his presence, we're with God. And so this is tuning into God with us. And would it be true to say, because I believe it is, that when we tune into these afflictive emotions, that's where God is.
Yes.
Because God is not in the moment of peace. God is there, right there in the midst of all that is unfavorable and all that doesn't feel right or good. So let's take a moment, and for the next, let's just say 3 or 4 minutes, you're going to mostly hear silence, but I'm going to ask Peter to kind of guide through the process. And if you will here on the 25th floor of this building in New York City, looking out at the skyline, just kind of tune into what's happening in you. And it might be something that's just maybe a little bit of anticipation about kind of moving to the next step of our day, or about the noise in the background, but just walk us through that as if somebody is listening and wanting to kind of watch you do this.
Yeah. So let me do this. Let me go back to, because we talked about this on the walk to your room. When sitting in St. Patrick's Cathedral, I had an intense irrational fear, but it was intense. Like I wanted to get out of the cathedral. So I want to run with that.
Let me say something. I don't think it was irrational, because I had the same kind of thought. I didn't, I'm not as neurotic as you, so I didn't stay with it. But
it's true.
We're walking down the street, and there's a parade today here on Fifth Avenue, and they place big concrete blocks on the sidewalks so that some nut or a terrorist can't drive down the sidewalk with a vehicle, like has happened in Charlottesville and other places. And there are police everywhere for this parade. And this is New York City. It's not irrational that somebody would walk into that church with a backpack. So now, if I go, yeah, that's going to happen, then that's irrational. But it's a possibility. And I think that's important to say. Somebody gets on the plane or on a plane and they go, this plane's going to crash. I'm convinced of it. There's a possibility that the plane could crash, but if they indulge that.
Yeah.
So again, even the idea that you had this particular thought, accepting that, and maybe by calling it irrational, which we love to do in psychology, right? Their cognitive distortions are irrational thoughts, and then there's rational thoughts.
No, when does a legitimate fear get so distorted that it becomes now I'm living under this wound of fear?
Yes,
and so it's funny.
Back to St. Patrick's and your fear of.
Okay, so we're doing centering prayer, and I have this fear come up, and I consider myself a New Yorker. Right, I grew up in the North Shore of Long Island. I've been in Metro New York for most of my adult life, and so I've had other moments like that on the Verrazano Bridge, in a train, wherever. Right, so this thought comes, and I have this fear that we're in a dangerous place. Right. And I know I'm going to just say it. Here's my self-talk. This is irrational, but it's rising. It's rising. I feel intense. I feel a desire to leave. Literally. Yeah. A desire to leave and get out. So hilariously, it was almost comical because I knew that we were preparing to go discuss the welcoming prayer. I go, hey, probably a pretty good time to pull out the old welcoming prayer. So I put my hand on my chest, and sometimes I feel fear in my throat. Put my hand on my chest because my heart was beating a little faster. And I began to just feel it. Imagine my fear coming true. But feel the fear of it, the intensity of it. This intensity of it is, it's red. It's a red fear, danger. And so I begin to feel that. I feel it in my body. And after I've allowed maybe, 30 seconds, 40 seconds of feeling that, I begin to say, welcome fear. Welcome uncertainty. Welcome feeling unsafe. Welcome. Welcome vulnerability. Welcome vulnerability. Welcome fear. Welcome unknown. Feel it more. Feel it more. Feel it more. Welcome fear. And Michael, I'm telling you, at some point, like my heart rate's slowing down. The grip of the fear is loosening. It's loosening. I'm present. I have no desire to leave. And I still have, but the fear's present, but it's not, the power of it's dissipating. And at some point, I can just say, it's yours. It's yours, Lord.
And there's really a point of trusting, even just tuning in and putting your hand over that feeling of fear. There's a trust that says it's okay to be with this.
Yeah. Yes.
And when we hear in the scriptures, do not be anxious about anything, fear not, for I am with you. Cast your anxiety upon him. That's not something that we do by virtue of rehearsing a propositional truth with a chapter and a verse attached to it. We surrender it, we cast it, we fear not by being present to it and then allowing it to be released in the presence of love. So this is really a practice where we learn that love has us and that we are securely attached to the source of love, and that the goal of our spirituality is to be securely attached to God. And we don't push away all the unpleasant, all the, quote, negative, the distressing or afflictive things that we experience internally. We welcome them. We learn to be with them. And in practicing the presence of these experiences that we'd rather push away or deny, that's how we learn to be present to God. And I've said this before, but that for those who have heard this phrase, practicing the presence of God, Brother Lawrence's book from the 13th or 14th century, I've often said that we struggle to practice the presence of God because we don't know how to practice the presence of ourselves. And how can I be present to you if I'm not present to myself? If I'm watching the TV screen over here, or if I'm looking out the window at the parade being set up down below, I'm not going to be able to be present to you. And I find that so much of my life I've lived not present, but checked out, tuned out, and not even really realizing that. So I want to thank you today for talking about the welcoming prayer, for the way it's been a practice in your life. I want to encourage our listeners to experiment with this, to experiment with surrendering to love. So thanks for listening today, everybody. We'll be back in another podcast just coming up in a week or so, talking about the Serenity Prayer. And that podcast plus this podcast on the welcoming prayer, plus Peter and I's 2 previous podcasts talking about surrendering control and not being attached to the outcomes. This is a series of 4 that will all fit together nicely to help us to internalize and to integrate peace and wholeness into our lives. So we'll talk to you next time. From New York City, it's Peter Zaremba and Michael saying, bless you.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.